Hello everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on setting a science-based target for the professional services sector. Before we get started, I would like to go over a few items so you know how to participate in today's webinar. You've joined the presentation listening using your computer speaker system by default. If you would prefer to join over the telephone, just select telephone in the audio pane and the dial-in information will be displayed. You will have the opportunity to submit your questions to today's presenters by typing your questions into the questions pane of the control panel on the right-hand side of your screen. You can send in your questions at any time during the presentation, and we will collect these and address them during the Q&A session at the end or afterwards via email. I would now like to introduce today's presenter, Tiffany Aries from the Carbon Trust.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this webinar for raising the ambition to 1.5 degrees and for setting science-based target for the professional services sector. So today I'll be joined by two other speakers, Steve Kenzie from the UN Global Compact Network UK and Karen Higgins from Grant Thornton. So just to do some quick introductions, so my name is Tiffany Aries. I am a client executive at the Carbon Trust, and I focus most of my work on business development within the professional services sector. Steve, if you could quickly introduce yourself as well, that would be great.
Hi everyone, Steve Kenzie from the UN Global Compact Network UK. I'm the Executive Director and really appreciate you all joining us this morning. Thanks.
And Karen, if you could also introduce yourself, that would be fantastic.
Hi, I'm Karen Higgins, so I head up sustainability in Grant Thornton in the UK with a real focus on reducing environmental impact and also driving positive social change.
Fantastic, thank you so much. So just before we go and take you through the science-based target setting process, I'm going to hand over to Steve from the UN Global Compact Network UK to take you through some background on raising the ambition to 1.5 campaign and the UN Global Compact Network.
Thanks, Tiffany. So yeah, really briefly, UN Global Compact is the world's largest corporate sustainability initiative. There are over 10,000 companies around the world that have made a commitment to our 10 universal principles drawn from UN treaties in the areas of human rights, labor, environment, and anti-corruption. It's a broad remit to advance those principles through business around the world and to promote the Sustainable Development Goals. At the moment, like I suppose all of us, we are striving to effectively respond to the COVID-19 crisis, and I urge you to have a look at the Global Compact website. Every Tuesday, they've been organizing a fantastic webinar series on the crisis, getting leading speakers from various sectors to enlighten us. Yesterday, looked at the impact on human rights of COVID-19, and we had Michelle Bachelet, the head of the UN High Commission for Human Rights, alongside of a number of other fantastic speakers. Next slide, please. We are really delighted to be working with the Carbon Trust on this series of webinars on science-based targets. As you see on the slide, we have a number more still to go. We'll be doing diving into the implications for each sector of setting a science-based target over the course of the next 2 months. Next, please. And finally, I just want to raise your awareness of the Business Ambition for 1.5 Degrees project. This is an urgent call to action led by a global coalition of UN agencies, business and industry leaders. Over the past several years, obviously, science-based targets have become more and more essential, I think, and over 800 companies have already committed, but we need more. It's really interesting to note, I'm reading in the news that the current crisis is likely to lead to a reduction in carbon emissions this year of 5.5%, which is extraordinary, but also sad when the experts are saying we need to see a reduction of over 7% over the next 10 years if we're going to keep temperatures below a 1.5 degree increase. So as much as the extraordinary changes we've seen in our lives over the last few weeks has had an impact, we're still going to need more. And to get there, we need the structure and the rigor that science-based targets bring. So I really appreciate you committing your time this morning to learn more about this really important agenda, and we look forward to working with you on science-based targets going forward. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Steve. That was a really great overview. And now to give a quick introduction to the Carbon Trust as well. So if you're not familiar with us, we are a mission-driven climate change consultancy, and our mission is to accelerate the move to a sustainable low-carbon economy. We are an international organisation, and as you can see on the map, we have offices all around the world working to help governments, NGOs and organisations of all sizes, right from SMEs all the way through to multinational global organisations with their climate change response, looking at targets, but also working with them to measure their environmental impact and in various different areas. We have nearly 20 years experience in sustainability, and our network of experts around the world, so 220 employees to date, have been working hard with all these different bodies to support the goals and like Steve mentioned, the global UN goals that we all share. So over the past, just to demonstrate some of the Carbon Trust expertise in terms of the topic that we'll be discussing today. So we've been working with organisations since 2015 to set science-based targets and also to align with 1.5 degrees. And you can see here some of the organisations that we've worked with over the past couple of years. So by attending this webinar, we hope that you will understand how to set a science-based target within the professional services sector, the requirements of the setting a Scope 3 target, also the challenges and opportunities of actually setting a science-based target and what that means for you as a business and for your strategy. And also some practical tips on how to get started, and we'll get some insight from Karen as well later as a business that has already set a target, so she can share some of her learnings with all of you today. If you have any questions during the webinar, then please feel free to type in your questions in the questions box, as Maddie mentioned at the beginning, and we'll be able to respond during the Q&A session at the end, or we will give you a direct response following the webinar if we run out of time. So just to give you some climate science background, to contextualise all of this a little bit. So we know today that global temperatures have already increased by 1 degree since pre-industrial times, and the graph here clearly demonstrates this upwards trend that we see. But why does this matter? So why should we be concerned about limiting temperatures to 1.5 degrees? Well, this is because scientifically the implications of our world warming to above this temperature threshold are pretty serious, and they wouldn't only have implications, environmental impacts, but with increasing temperatures, there would also be a number of social and economic impacts that would come alongside this. So within the environmental impacts, obviously increased heat waves, I think some of us have already experienced this, but also an increasing number of extreme weather events, loss of biodiversity and drop in crop yields. These obviously have direct social and economic links. So in terms of social impacts, I'm sure we've seen that with increased temperatures there is a likelihood of having more frequent and serious pandemics. So I'm sure you've seen this on the news recently. So it's definitely a good reason to double our efforts to reduce our current warming rate. But obviously this would also have a very large economic impact, not only on businesses, but also on a personal level as well. So what does this mean, and how does it relate to science-based targets? So science-based targets became mainstream following the Paris Agreement in 2015, which was then ratified in 2016. So this was an agreement, a global agreement signed by 195 nations committing to limit temperatures to well below 2 degrees, as well as pursuing efforts to remain at a 1.5 degree increase. And indeed, in 2018, the IPCC, so Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change special report, highlighted the real need for keeping within this 1.5 degree threshold, but also to strive towards net zero emissions in the second half of the century, so by 2050. So what is a science-based target? What are science-based targets? So a target can be considered science-based if they are in line with what the latest climate science says is necessary to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement, which, like I've just mentioned, is to limit global warming to well below 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels and to pursue efforts to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. So if you take your attention to the graph here on the right, you can see what our current warming projections are in the grade area. But you can also see the effects of what current policies would help us to achieve, and what perhaps more optimistic policies, so more stringent environmental policy stances would allow us to achieve, as well as the pledges and targets that have already been announced. But as this graph clearly demonstrates, there is quite a gap between what we may achieve and what is needed in order to remain within this 1.5 or well below 2 degree scenario. And hopefully this is what the Science-Based Targets initiative is helping to bridge, is this gap. So having more and more organisations around the world committing and setting targets aligned with these pathways should help to bridge that gap. So besides being aligned to climate science, there are also a number of other benefits of setting a science-based target as an organisation. So these are some results from a YouGov survey, which showed various different reasons why companies opted for science-based targets. So strengthened brand reputation, helping to drive innovation, whether that be business model innovation or product innovation, gaining competitive advantage, boosting investor confidence, and then of course increased resilience against future legislation is an obvious one here. So setting a target in practice, the SBTi is the organisation that has developed the methodologies and the pledge and review process for these targets. So this is a joint initiative between CDP, the UN Global Compact, the World Resource Institute, and the WWF. And they have kind of, as a joint initiative, developed methodologies for setting science-based targets and have set up this, like I've mentioned, this pledge and review process for the targets set by organisations. The Carbon Trust is also a member of the Technical Advisory Group, so we've taken many organisations on this journey. So we're very experienced and well equipped to support you throughout this process as well. Taking a more sector-specific view, so as of the 21st of April 2020, so last week, there are 41 professional services companies who have committed to setting a science-based target. 17 of those already have had their science-based target approved, and we'll hear a little later on from Karen from Grant Thornton, who have already had a 1.5 degree approved target. As you can see on the graph on the right-hand side of the slide, so geographically, Europe is definitely a leader in regards to both committing and setting targets, but we hope that 2020 will bring a new wave of organisations doing the same throughout the world as well. So before I go into the actual methodologies for setting a target, just a quick recap of the terms and definitions in case anyone isn't familiar. So in the organisational carbon emissions are defined into 3 scopes, as defined in the Greenhouse Gas Protocol corporate standards. So scope 1 direct emissions, which is the arrow you can see there in the middle, relate to direct emissions that come from your company facilities, so offices, for example, and your company vehicles, so company cars, for example. And then your scope 2 indirect emissions, they relate to any emissions from purchased electricity, heat or steam. So for professional services, this is likely to be just your electricity procurement here. And then scope 3 is what we would call your value chain emissions. So these are 14 categories which are emissions that arise outside of your organisation, but with which you have more or less control or influence over. So not all scope 3 categories are relevant to all businesses. Some you will be able to exclude. For example, you probably will not have franchisers, so that may not be a relevant category for you. Some categories can also be excluded if they are considered de minimis as well. Within professional services, we often find that business travel is a big category that may be one of your scope 3 hotspots, and so there are a number of different things that you can do to limit and reduce your business travel emissions. And also purchased goods and services is often a big category, not only in professional services, but in most sectors, this tends to be one of the big hotspot areas. So now that we've been through the different scopes, I'll take you through the different requirements for setting science-based targets. So within scope 1 and 2 targets first, so these have to cover company-wide emissions, so they have to cover all of your scope 1 and 2 emissions on a global basis. So if you have offices all over the world, you will need to account for emissions for all of those offices, and you can't choose a subset of those. The targets need to cover a minimum of 5 years and a maximum of 15 years from the date the target is submitted. So these are essentially short to medium term targets. They need to be aligned to a well below 2 degree or a 1.5 degree scenario. The Science Based Target Initiative used to accept a 2 degree scenario, but this is no longer accepted under their guidance. And the use of carbon offsets is not counted, so you cannot purchase offsets to compensate for your emissions as a part of your carbon emissions reduction. For scope 3, so the requirements are slightly different. So you will need to set a science-based target if your scope 3 emissions are 40% or more of your total scope 1, 2 and 3 emissions. So this is very, very likely to be the case. Most businesses have a scope 3 that is larger than their scope 1 and 2 and represents significantly more emissions. So likelihood of setting that is very high. Targets have to cover at least 2/3 of your scope 3 emissions. So it doesn't need to cover all of your scope 3 emissions. So you'll need to kind of make a choice around which categories are going to be included within your target. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. You should be setting an absolute target aligned to well below 2 degrees. You can also use an economic or physical intensity target as well here. And you can also use a supplier engagement target, which requires them to set their own target, their own science-based target within 5 years of you setting yours. So this is sometimes a popular way of engaging with suppliers as well. So the requirements I went through were for large organisations. So if you are a small or medium-sized enterprise, an SME, then the science-based target has recently published an update on the requirements for this type of organisation. So for the SBTi, a small or medium-sized enterprise is considered as an enterprise that employs less than 500 employees. So if this is the case, then you would be in this bracket. So again, for a scope 1 and 2 target, it has to cover your company-wide scope 1 and 2 emissions, so there's no change there. But what is different is that they have given 2 options for your scope 1 and 2 target. So you can either choose to align to a 1.5 degree scenario, which would be a 50% reduction by 2030 against a 2018 baseline. Or you can choose to follow a well below 2 degree scenario, which is a 30% reduction by 2030 against the same 2018 baseline. Again, offsets are not counted within your reduction. With scope 3, the requirements are quite different, so there isn't an obligation to set a scope 3 target. However, you must commit to at least measuring your scope 3 footprint and reducing your scope 3 emissions. So it doesn't ask you to give this reduction a number, but it is a commitment to ensuring that you are taking steps to reduce your impact within scope 3. So digging a little deeper now on how to set science-based targets, what you need to know is that really this involves 3 main key steps. So the first is to assess what the global carbon budget is. The analogy we make at the Carbon Trust is that this is a pie essentially. So the first step would be how large is the pie? The second step would be to calculate your own business's carbon budget, and taking the analogy forward, this is working out how large your slice of the pie is as a business. And then the final step is to compare your carbon budget and your footprint, and to see if you are eating too much pie in this case, and if so, by how much, and how much will you need to reduce by. So there are a number of different methodologies, but essentially they all take these 3 key steps to set the target. So the size of the carbon budget is defined by what we call emission scenarios. So there are essentially 3 different emission scenarios. So the 2 degree scenario is the first one, which I have mentioned is one which is no longer accepted by the SBTi. There is also the well below 2 degree equivalent scenario, which is essentially a 1.75 degree scenario. And then finally, the 1.5 degree scenario, which is the current best practice for setting a science-based target. And obviously is the one that we are encouraging. So the carbon budget for a company, so coming back to the second step of the process I've just described, is defined by allocating the global budget to the company's activities, and then using one of the below 2 methods shown here. So these are kind of the options for setting scope 1 and 2 science-based targets. So if we look first of all at the sectoral decarbonisation approach, or SDA, so the SDA, what it does essentially is define a reduction pathway by breaking down the global carbon budget into sectors and mapping that against the activity in those sectors, so in the sector concerned. So this defines the intensity pathways for those sectors and requires companies to align their carbon intensity to the sector's carbon intensity by 2050. So this means that all companies will converge to the same carbon intensity by 2050, as you can see on the graph on the left here. This method is only available for well below 2 degrees, however. So if you are looking to set a 1.5 degree target, then you will need to set what we call an absolute contraction, a target following the absolute contraction method. So this is a simpler approach which applies to the same reduction pathway for all companies within a given time frame. So this is useful in a sector where there isn't a single simple output that can be used to define an intensity metric, and also obviously useful for those who are looking to align with a 1.5 degree scenario, as in this case that option is available. So to explain a little bit more about the methodologies, so if you look on this slide, so this shows on the left that we have the source of the data which defines the overall carbon budget. So it's from the IPCC, and then on the right we have the data produced by the International Energy Agency, IEA, in their Energy Technology Perspectives report, which breaks down the carbon budget into different sectors. And as you can see from this graph, there are certain sectors which are going to decarbonise more quickly than others, simply because there's a greater capacity to reduce emissions in certain sectors compared to others. This sector level pathway is then mapped against activity data to give the overall intensity pathway, which is then compared with the company pathway to define the reduction that is required for a science-based target. So here you can see the main pathways within the sectoral decarbonisation approach. So for the professional services sector, the appropriate method to follow, the appropriate pathway to follow is the service building approach that you can see here in the main SDA sectors. However, if you are looking to align your target to 1.5 degrees, you will need to use the absolute contraction method. For the SBTi for this method, the SBTi has taken the data from the IPCC 1.5 degree special report, and here, so you can see here on the right on the graph that there were various different scenarios that were in this report, about 90 different scenarios, and they have essentially filtered these in order to develop a single pathway for a well below 2 degrees and for a 1.5 degree pathway. So in order to do this, what they've done is looking at the different scenarios that were put forward, filtering to have only the ones which were aligned to 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees, and then going further, looking removing those that have an emissions budget which has exceeded the emissions budget that we're aiming for, ensuring that the scenarios all have emissions peaking between 2020 and 2025, and then also removing those that lack any credibility. So this is, for example, where the decarbonisation that should have happened within the last 5 years, for example, is actually greater than what we have seen, and so is no longer relevant. So hopefully this all makes sense, and you can see how the absolute contraction method was developed, and how you can use that to calculate a target for your own organisation. So I think one of the things that we find is most helpful for organisations looking to set their own science-based target is hearing firsthand how this is done in practice, and getting insight from other organisations within their own sector who have successfully set a target and successfully had that target approved by the SBTi. So today, Karen from Thornton is going to join us and talk a little bit about this. So Karen, thank you so much for joining us today. It's a pleasure to have you on the webinar. It would be great if you could start off by giving us a little introduction to yourself and a little introduction to Grant Thornton as a business and the science-based target project that you have completed.
Yeah, certainly. So Karen Higgins, as I mentioned earlier, I'm sorry, I'm just going to share my webcam. There we go. So hopefully, there we go. Hopefully
Yes.
you're better to see me now. So as I said, part of my role is looking at how we minimise that environmental impact. And science-based targets, we have been working, we have a environmental consultancy that we work with quite closely and have done for a number of years. And we decided a few years ago that we wanted to, this was the right way to go. And therefore, we have set our science-based targets, and therefore we're going to reduce our carbon emissions by 21% by 2023. So we had a sort of more short-term target because we wanted to continue to monitor and review, and therefore then set a new one going forward.
Great, thank you so much. That was really good. I think one of the hardest parts of setting a science-based target sometimes is actually getting that internal buy-in to make that decision, to make the commitment to actually set the target in the first place. So in your case, was this a top-down push, or was it a bottom-up push? Which stakeholders were involved, and how did you engage them in helping them to not only understand but also want to achieve this science-based target goal?
Well, when it came to actually the decision around science-based targets, it was fairly easy. But the reason for that is because I'd had the hard slog previous to that. So a number of years ago, when we started thinking about ISO 14001, so we were looking about having some kind of accreditation for our environmental management system. And obviously a cost and a resource associated with that. And it was a time, when you look back now, you think, my goodness, I can't believe that we weren't talking about it as much as we are now. But that was the case a number of years ago. And therefore, conversations with our senior leadership team were a little bit around we know it's really important, but also so are these things. And therefore, when we look at it in terms of priorities, actually, we need to focus on this. So, let's give it another 6 months. Let's give it another year. And I felt like I was there banging my drum to sort of say, this is so important. So for me, that was the hard bit. And the reason that started to change, I think, was the continuation of drip feeding them, but also the demand that was coming from our clients and our contacts. So the kind of things that we were being asked. So when we were being sent tender documents, it started to change from, do you have an environmental policy, tick box, yes or no, to actually, do you have any kind of accreditations? Do you have ISO 14001 accreditation? What areas do you focus on? So the questions started getting a little bit more detailed and a little bit more complex. So the demand was coming from our clients because our clients wanted to know. The problem, I suppose, with that is sometimes they were something like 2% of the bid when you were looking at it in totality. So people would say, well, actually, this part of it is 20%, that bit's only 2%. But again, that started to change and that started to increase. And also then the demand from our people, people coming into our business, particularly young people coming into the business who are informed, they completely know where they want to work. They want to work for a firm that is that places this as really important. So the demand was coming from our clients, the demand was coming from our people, and also from the sustainability team that were really sort of gunning for this. So when we got that and we were able to get the accreditation for our environmental management system, we'd gone through that hard slog and it then became so much easier. So by the time we got to the point where we were thinking about science-based targets, it was a bit of a no-brainer. And it was a bit of like, yes, absolutely, this is the right thing we need to do.
Yeah, Well, yeah, I mean, it's certainly great to see all these different levers and seeing that it's not only an internal, but it's also an external engagement. So that's really great to see. And I think once you've made that decision and you've sort of made the plunge, sometimes there is a little bit of a tricky, decision before and throughout the process as to, whether to set how to set the ambition of your target. And in your case, had you already decided that you would align with a 1.5 degree scenario, or did you also map out a well below 2 degree scenario as well, and how did those conversations happen?
Okay, so when we first agreed that we were going to go down the science-based target route, what we had done was actually we calculated our greenhouse gas emissions across our business before the publication of the IPCC report of 1.5 degrees. So, at the time, the well below 2 degrees was the trajectory that the SBTi was aligned to. And so therefore we were working with Green Element and SBTi to set our initial targets to the well below 2 degrees. Once our targets were validated by the Science Based Target Initiative, the report was published. And then what we did was we very quickly thought, actually, we've been through this work. If we really want to make a difference, and if we really want to do our bit to prevent the planet going past this kind of tipping point, we need to make those changes. So we kind of went back. So we kind of did the work twice in quite a short period of time. But we went back and we then realigned or recalculated, if you like, all of our targets and set them on the 1.5 degree trajectory. Because we felt that that was the right thing to do, and we felt it was the right thing to do very, very quickly. And when you're kind of in the zone for, you've done the work, and it's actually, let's just continue and get them set so that we can then now focus on working towards them. So in terms of, it wasn't sort of tricky as such, it was just tight, sort of bad timing, I suppose, on our part, that we just started it before the report was published, and then we had to go back. But in terms of deciding, to me, there was no decision. It was just the right thing to do.
Yeah, that completely makes sense. And I think, like you, I'm sure there were lots of other businesses who also found themselves in the same situation. And I think a lot of businesses that have set a 2 degree aligned target a couple of years back have also had to update their targets to meet this new requirement as well. So as you know, the Science Based Target Initiative requires you to set a Scope 3 target as well for it to, if your Scope 3 emissions are above 40%. In your case, when you were choosing which categories to include within your Scope 3 target, apart from the size of the categories, so for it to meet the minimum requirement of looking at 2/3 of your emissions, were there any other factors that you considered when deciding how and where you were going to make emissions reductions within your value chain? And to what extent are you sort of engaging or planning on engaging with suppliers, etc., to meet this target?
Yeah, so we
just a small question.
So, yeah, it's like, where do I start? Yeah, so I think as well as size, we looked at impact. Where could we make the most impact, and where were those areas where we could make the impact most quickly? So through the environmental management system that we already had and the reporting that we were already doing, we had included certain things such as business travel, which is, as you say, for all of us, it's a big one, water use, paper and IT purchases, waste. And we conducted this kind of scoping exercise, looking at all of those 15 Scope 3 categories, looking at where the hard data was available, looking where it wasn't, looking at where that financial spend was available. And for us, it was very, very clear which ones were, we could make the most impact to, and that was travel, particularly air travel, and travel in general, but really our focus is on air and road, because obviously if you stop that, you need people to travel somehow, so they'll go by rail. And then things like waste, paper consumption, areas where we could, our people could really make a difference. So there's certain things that are more of an in the other scopes that are more of an operational basis, whereas this is something that we can control, if you like, through our own behavior. And control is the wrong word. We can encourage people to change their behavior in order to make this difference, and we can put things in place. So one of the things that we have put in place is we've really looked at our travel policy, and it's really interesting in these current times how changes have been made very quickly. And Steve, you mentioned about the reduction, experts saying that the carbon emissions will reduce by 5.5% this year because of the way we're working. And some of the challenges, the challenging conversations, the discussions sometimes I have with people sort of saying, well, I really need to go and see my clients 6 times a year, and I need to travel up to Scotland and to see them, and I need to travel by plane. Actually, now it might prove that they don't need to, and perhaps maybe they make that trip twice and they go by rail, and actually the other 4 times that they can do by phone, and they can put their video cameras on, because this is how we're working now. And I think there are a lot of lessons that we're learning from this current time that we can take forward and continue. So for me, the travel was something that we had the most allowed us to have the most impact. The other thing that we did, and sorry, I know it's not scope 3, but in terms of scope 1 and 2 and our electricity consumption, what we did that really made a difference very quickly, was low-hanging fruit, was we changed all of the our energy suppliers to 100% renewable, go back to electricity contract where we own the contract. So some of our offices we own, some of them are landlord offices. So where we were in control of it, we did that, and that has made a huge difference. I think our electricity consumption, or the emissions, are down by something like 78%. So that was, to have that conversation. And it's funny, and again, it's funny because it's one of those things where we'd had those conversations previously, and it was a hard conversation to have. I mean, I think the prices have come down now, but maybe when we first started having those conversations, the prices were a lot more expensive. So that does have to be taken into consideration. Whereas now they're quite similar. So actually, by saying that, well, this is where we want to go, we're making a real commitment in making that change. And that's a really great way that we can communicate to our people, to say that as a firm, this is what we're doing that is helping us to achieve those targets. And also, we now want your support in doing other things in the ways that people can. So looking at the way you travel, looking at, do you really need to print that document, which is something else. Now we're not printing anything in the workplace. So hopefully that will make a real difference going forward.
Yeah, all those initiatives sound fantastic, and like you say, hopefully these new behaviours will continue post lockdown.
Yeah. Fingers crossed.
So yeah, fingers crossed. I think that's all been really useful. Sometimes, when all of us do things, hindsight is a great thing. And so looking back at this journey that you've been on, in setting targets, in engaging with staff, in engaging with customers, is there anything that you would do differently, or do you have any sort of golden nuggets that you want to share with the audience here today for organisations that are in the sector and who are thinking about maybe setting a target, and just a little bit of motivation for them?
Yeah, okay. I'm not sure about hindsight as such, because just of the way that we, the timing for us, but
yeah.
I would say that if you're going to do the work of going through this process, then it's much more efficient to set your targets at 1.5. Obviously, we couldn't do that at the time because the IPCC report hadn't been published, and the new tools, the SBTi tools, hadn't been written. But I think if I was advising any other companies going forward, if you're going through the process, just go straight for the 1.5. So that would be the first thing I'd say. The second is to do a really good scoping exercises around your scope 3s. Brainstorm everything that comes into your firm, everything that goes out and where it goes in between. Kind of write it all down, see where you can get all of the data from. So whether as I mentioned earlier, whether it's hard data, whether it's whether you can get data from finance, and so that you have the spend on all of those operations. And that's a really, really good way to start to think about where you can have that impact. And again, this isn't hindsight, but I suppose the one thing that if I could wave a magic wand and wish or change something is, I wish that it was a lot easier to get data from suppliers. Sometimes it's really, really hard. An example of that, something that I'm going through at the moment actually, is getting electricity data from our offices that are our landlord offices, because sometimes we're recharged a percentage of the building due to the square foot that we have. Sometimes it does that take into account communal areas or not? Sometimes, well, it's just the whole process is really, really tricky. And when you have a process that you set the process up and it works as long as you get the data. So that would be if I had a magic wand, I would think about how that process could be a lot easier.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you so much for answering our questions today. That was hugely helpful. And if anyone in the audience has any questions for Karen, she is staying on until the end of the webinar. So if we have time for those, then you can definitely ask, and you can also submit questions to be answered later as well. Right, great, thank you. So I am now going to move on to the sort of final stages of this webinar. So I think looking at what next steps you would need to take. So obviously, as Karen mentioned just now, so the measurement phase is really crucial, really important. Having an accurate measurement of your scope 1, 2, and then an accurate scoping exercise, and then scope 3 footprint to establish what your baseline is really, really, really important. Building that business case internally for setting science-based targets during the measurement phase, as well as during the target setting phase, to ensure that you are able to leverage the different levers internally and externally to ensure that you are able to make reductions going forward. Set your science-based targets. So as Karen mentioned, in the current climate, setting a 1.5 degree target is probably the most efficient way of going forward, in the sense that you wouldn't have to update your target in future, hopefully. And then looking even further, so developing your reduction roadmap on how you plan to meet those reduction targets within scope 1, 2, and 3, and then aligning with net zero if you would like to take a more leadership strategy in this area. So as I've thrown in net zero there, I'll just quickly go through the definition of net zero, as this seems to be some confusion around what this is. So this is the SBTi proposed definition for net zero, which the Carbon Trust also follow. So reaching net zero emissions for a company means achieving a state in which the activities within the full value chain of a company result in no net impact on the climate from greenhouse gas emissions. This is achieved by reducing value chain greenhouse gas emissions in line with a 1.5 degree pathways, and by balancing the impact of any remaining greenhouse gas emissions with an appropriate amount of carbon removals. So this is the official definition, well, proposed by the SBTi. If you're interested in finding out a little bit more about net zero or if you'd like to understand what the implications are of this, we do have a net zero webinar that we recently hosted, so you can find that on the Carbon Trust website. And then quickly to give you the difference between net zero and carbon neutrality, because this is also something that we get a lot of questions about and which organisations get confused. So essentially there are some main differences between the two. So in terms of boundary, for a net zero ambition, you will need to include all three scopes. Whereas under the PAS 2060 carbon neutral requirement, you will need to include your scope 1 and 2, and scope 3 is encouraged, but it isn't mandatory. So you don't have to include your scope 3 within that. It can also be relevant for a product or service, whereas a net zero commitment is a full organisational commitment. In terms of ambition, the difference is there is also a difference. So under net zero, you need to align to a 1.5 degree science-based trajectory. The PAS 2060 carbon neutral standard doesn't define a specific level of ambition. So you do need to ensure that you include a target within your qualifying explanatory statement, which has your carbon management plan, but there isn't a minimum requirement for reductions here. And then in regards to the approach for residual emissions, so the net zero approach will require you to compensate for emissions using greenhouse gas removals, whereas under the carbon neutrality standard, this can be compensated through carbon offsets. And again, if you're not too sure what the difference is between greenhouse gas removals and carbon offsets, this is also explained in the Net Zero webinar. It is a bit of a technical area, and there are quite a few distinctions between the two, so it's important to understand the difference between those. And then finally, so another update here from the SBTi. So there's been an increased emphasis on corporates signing up for the business ambition commitment letter for 1.5 degrees rather than the standard commitment letter. So it really shows this drive and this push to encourage organisations to sign up to this ambitious and best practice commitment compared to the past. So just to wrap this up before we take some audience questions, so some key learnings from this webinar. So hopefully you will have gathered that accurate measurement is really important and is the first step on your target setting journey. If you do this right the first time, then it's much easier going forward, although you can improve your data quality as the years go by as well. Ensuring that you have engagement within your organisation throughout the process is really important to ensure that you meet the reduction targets that you set yourself. Aligning to current best practice, of course, it is a great way of making sure that you reap the most benefits from setting a target and going through that full process. And then even if you want to look even longer term, so obviously a science-based target, like I mentioned, is a short to medium term target. But if you want to look even further down the line, then looking to align to net zero is also a really great way to demonstrate your leadership strategy. Good. So I think now we'll take some questions from the audience. We may not have time to answer that many, but if you do have any follow-up questions, we will be following up this webinar with an email. And also you can see some of our contact details on the screen here if you would like to contact us following this webinar as well. So Maddie, have we got any audience questions?
Great, thank you, Tiffany. Yes, we have had a lot of questions come in, particularly for Karen. So I will try and, as we've got a couple of minutes left, cover as many of those as possible. So I think the first question, which I think is relatable to a lot of attendees today around Scope 3, is what happens if my company isn't able to set a Scope 3 target at the moment? Can I still submit a Scope 1 and 2 target?
Very good question. Of course, as I mentioned throughout this webinar, the Science-Based Target Initiative does require you to set a Scope 3 target in order to have this officially approved, officially accepted as a valid target. However, if you have already set a Scope 1 and 2 target, you are able to submit that for a preliminary evaluation, if you will, to ensure that that is aligned. So you can do that in the meantime, but you will need to eventually set a Scope 3 target in order to have this fully approved and up on the Science-Based Target Initiative website.
Great, thanks, Tiff. So a question now, I'm going to ask it to both Karen and Tiffany. So this is a question around engaging with suppliers. So Karen, the specific question is, how did you engage with your suppliers? Was there a specific supplier questionnaire, and how did you put this forward? And I guess, Tiffany, it would be good to enhance on that further if you've got any advice on communicating to stakeholders within your company.
Mm-hmm.
Shall I go first?
Go for it.
Okay. I suppose for us, we're lucky as we don't have a huge amount of national suppliers that are, when we're looking at these particular Scope 3 categories and impacts, if you like, in terms of where our focus is on. So, for example, if we're talking about the electricity firms that, you know, across, at the time probably we had, I don't know, 26, 27 offices. We're not having 26, 27 different firms. So it was a case of conversations, you know, working with our procurement team and making sure that we had that introductory conversation, and when we had our quarterly meetings that we continued to have that conversation so that they were absolutely clear about what we were trying to do and how they could support us. In terms of our travel company, for example, we book all of our travel online and we go through a particular company. And it was working with that company to say, for example, you know, as well as showing the price when you're showing different options, can you show carbon emissions? You know, it's that kind of thing. You know, how can we work together to achieve a kind of greater good, if you like, because you know, we want to, you know, everybody wants to move in the same direction, whether all of those firms are signed up to science-based targets or not. Everybody wants to move in the same direction, and you know, we need to support each other in getting there. So I think it's open communication, regular communication, and making sure there's a transparency in terms of what our targets are and what we're wanting to do and achieve.
Yeah, and I agree with all of those points. And I think what we find often in projects is when you as a company can really demonstrate that you've measured your own operational target and you have a number of initiatives and you're doing lots and lots of different various things to reduce your own impact, it also really helps with conversations with suppliers. So, you know, they can see that you're also doing lots and lots of work internally and making them feel a part of that journey with you is really important. So like you say, transparency is really key in this area.
Great, thank you both. I'm just going to ask one more question. I'm aware that we've just gone over at 11 o'clock, but I think this one would be really relevant to the whole audience. So Tiffany, you mentioned a 2018 baseline with a target period up to 2030, but what happens if a company starting now doesn't have that historic information? Can the target period be adjusted?
Yes, absolutely. Obviously not everyone will have this 2018 historic baseline, but you can of course use a 2019 baseline and adjust the target intensity according to that. So yeah, we absolutely can do that.
Great, thank you. So unfortunately we have run out of time, so we are going to leave the questions there, but hopefully that's given you an insight into how to get started into setting your science-based target to align with 1.5 within the professional services sector. So I'd like to take this opportunity to thank our presenters, so Steve Kenzie from the UN Global Compact Network UK, Tiffany from the Carbon Trust and Karen from Grant Thornton. This webinar has been recorded, so as mentioned, we've got the contact details on the page. If you would like to get in touch with any of the presenters from today, then please do. So thank you on behalf of the Carbon Trust and the UN Global Compact Network for joining us today on this webinar.